thing as I'm reaching for the Cheetos or the Oreos or whatever it is. Just being able to back up and say, okay, what am I
Awe Genge, this is Mental Mythos, hosted by Asego Toto.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mental Mythos. I'm your host, Asego Toto. And before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and also thank you for agreeing on doing this. I really appreciate it, and I feel like the conversation that we're about to have today, it's something that people actually don't talk about it, which is food addiction. And when someone thinks about food, they don't actually run to the fact that, oh, flip, someone is addicted to food. And also another thing, it's obesity. It's something, one of the, I've read somewhere, whereas it's an article that said that obesity is seen as one of the things that cause mental health problems. So through our conversation, it will be informative. The audience will relate to the conversation today, and also probably you will share some strategies how you yourself have, in a way, I would say, survived in terms of with this addiction, because addiction is not something that everyone, I would say everyone survives in a way, because it's quite difficult to stop those bad habits. Usually people are in this thing of wanting to be comfortable. They rather have this certain addiction rather than going into uncomfortable places, whereas they start to heal that addiction. So with those words, I would like to welcome you to Mental Mythos.
Thank you so much.
On your profile, you mentioned hitting rock bottom at 50. What was your pivotal moment that led you to realize that you are now you had enough? You are enough. Sorry, mistake.
As far as how what led me out of my rock bottom place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and that rock bottom place that I hit did not have to do with food addiction. Because that struggle with food came a little bit later after that. One of my rock bottom places was having an emotional addiction earlier in my 30s. And that was what really helped me understand addiction on a deeper level and more personal level, to where I'm able to help women with food addiction. So that rock bottom place that I hit came from being in a mentally, emotionally abusive marriage for 30 years, and finally leaving that marriage. And that was the most devastating moment of my life, was actually walking out the door and fleeing that marriage, and then facing life as a single mom in a low-paying job, and seeking to start a new career, going to school, and just really being hit in the face with life and the reality of what it's like to survive in that kind of a world. And I really felt very stuck. I really felt like I'm in a place emotionally and mentally that I can't get out of on my own. And I was going to counseling, but I was very depressed and very scared and feeling like the future didn't hold anything for me. And go ahead.
No, go ahead. I thought you were finished.
So as far as my way out, I went to a therapist, and he gave me 3 simple words that really just hit me to the core. And those words were, "You are enough." And they hit me so hard because I had spent the last 30 years of my marriage not being enough, not being good enough, not having value on my own as far as being in this marriage relationship, and feeling like I was to blame for this. And somehow those words just penetrated my soul. And he was actually a hypnotherapist, and he gave me a CD recording of his words to me that day, and I just listened over and over and over again. So I kept hearing those words, just kind of letting them sink into my subconscious mind. And that really was my path out from the rock bottom place.
And you mentioned some quite important things, whereas your abusive marriage, sorry for that, usually these things, I believe that when you are in a relationship that it's quite abusive, you tend to not knowing your worth, tend to be in that place of blaming yourself, of not doing enough, of not, I should have done that, in terms of keep blaming yourself. Before we get into that, I would like you to explain to us. You mentioned something that you mentioned emotional addiction. What did you mean by that?
Well, as I mentioned, my marriage was very stressful for me, and I had to keep everything inside, because if I expressed any kind of emotion, it was kind of jumped on and punished as being inferior. And I just learned to keep all of my thoughts and my emotion to myself. I was very inward, very withdrawn, just out of self-protection. And I remember one day, my husband and I and our 6 children were driving home from church, and he was in Christian ministry. It wasn't directly church ministry. I guess it would be para ministry. But we had this reputation to uphold, and it was all about appearances. And so we all had to look just perfect, like the perfect family, and me being the perfect wife and mother. And so we're driving home from that, and just for what I thought was a moment, I allowed something that I hadn't allowed prior, which was for my thought to wander and imagine a scenario where I was loved and cared for and validated as a human being, and with some other person besides my husband. And the rush of emotion that I experienced in that concocted scenario in my mind, it felt really good. It was like this dopamine hit, because I hadn't experienced that. And even though it was only up here, nothing else, it relieved stress. It relieved all of this pressure that I was feeling. And I remember thinking at that time, nobody will ever know. I will never tell anybody this. And I also thought, oh, this is just, allowing my mind to wander off in this direction, and then I'll come back. And it grabbed a hold of me, and I could not come back. I became addicted to those emotions and the thoughts, the feelings that came with it. And I just retreated more and more into this fantasy world. And I knew, because I never would have said, to myself, nobody will ever know, if I didn't have a lot of shame around that. So I just went deeper and deeper into shame, and deeper into being trapped in the make-believe world. And the harder I tried to get out of it, the worse it got. I could not get out of it on my own. And I was probably in that state for about a year of really thinking, okay, I'm stuck. I cannot do this. I can't get out. And finally, in desperation, I reached out to a friend, and I had to think long and hard. Okay, what friend could I trust enough to share this deep, dark secret with? And I'm sure I was just shaking. I was so scared to call her, and I did, and I bit out the story. And her first words to me were, "You're human. You're human." And when she said that, it just was such a relief. And even just admitting that to her, because shame lives in secrecy. The more we hide our shame, the more the shame thrives like a weed in the garden. And so just telling her that began my journey out of that pit that I was living in. And I began to find healing. So that is my experience with addiction. And when I was in my mid 50s and struggling more with my weight and with food, I didn't want anything to have a hold on me ever again, because I knew how horrible that was. And I began to realize there are millions of men and women, but especially I think there's a lot of women over 50 who are addicted to food, and they live in such shame. And there's so much shame in our society around obesity. And they, just like me, in my 30s experiencing that, they don't see a way out. But anyway, I was experiencing it on a micro level compared to what what I found in my work with so many women. But I can so relate to that feeling of helplessness and guilt and shame and everything else like that because of that experience in my 30s. And what I realized was that all addiction, it doesn't matter what the addiction is to, the object of the addiction, there's a need on the inside. There's an emotional, mental need on the inside. And we're reaching to something outside of ourselves to fill something, try to fill something that's a need on the inside. And it's just as much. Okay. All right. So, it doesn't matter what the addiction is to, it just can control your life in such a way and fill you with such shame that that's all you can think about. And so when you approach it with the idea of don't eat that, don't drink that, don't look at that, don't think that, and you're approaching it in the negative, that's the thing that you're focused on. And that's the thing that in your moment of weakness and in your low willpower time, that's what you're going to reach for. And that's why we stay stuck in the addiction and why we can't get out. And so what I found in my 30s was that I needed something positive in my life to move toward instead of trying to move away from these thoughts and feelings. And so when I would say, okay, don't think that thought, don't feel that feeling, it was so self-defeating and just made me feel even more like a failure and even more stuck. The harder I would try, the deeper I would get. And that's what I find with women battling food addiction too, is it's so much focused. And our whole dieting culture is so focused on what not to eat. And the more we focus on that, the more we're going to eat those things. It's just like a magnet that we're drawn to. And so going back to those 3 simple words that the therapist gave me, you are enough. What I do is teach women how to begin to value themselves, begin to start accepting, and not just accepting, but really loving and embracing who they are right now, and start to break through that self-hatred that is food addiction and binging. And the more we can start to value ourselves and really see ourselves as a tremendously worthwhile human being, the more we can start to look toward the positive. And it's just like when we have, let's say we have this beautiful $150,000 car and we go and we put bad gas in it or old gas or the cheapest gas. And we